This is the same logic that underpins no-fly zones, air interdiction strategies, and logistical isolation. Historically, such threats have marked the line between political pressure and preparations for military intervention. Trump's broader strategy toward Venezuela fits this model perfectly. It reflects what I call the maximum pressure doctrine, which the United States has applied not only in Latin America, but also in Iran, Cuba, and North Korea. The core idea is simple: inflict massive economic pain until the target government collapses or surrenders. This is not a spur-of-the-moment threat, nor is it merely rhetoric. It reflects a long tradition in U.S. foreign policy, using coercive pressure, economic, diplomatic, and increasingly militarized to impose political outcomes in Latin America. When Washington disapproves of a government in the region, it turns to sanctions, blockades, asset freezes, and threats of regime change. And now Trump is reviving these tools with Venezuela as his target of choice. Threatening to restrict another country's airspace is an extraordinary act. Sovereignty over airspace is one of the most fundamental principles of international law. When a president suggests that he could cut off a country's flights, shipping lanes, or international connections, he is implicitly implying a quasi-blockade. Under Trump, Venezuela has faced comprehensive financial sanctions, asset freezes on foreign governments, secondary sanctions on countries trading with it, and a global diplomatic campaign to discredit the government of Nicolas Maduro. The threat of an air blockade is simply the next step in the escalation process, a sign of a willingness to use military force to reinforce the economic war. In the domestic context of the United States, such threats serve a different purpose. They project strength. They allow Trump to position himself as a defender of American interests against hostile regimes, even if the threat from Venezuela is exaggerated or distorted. After all, Venezuela does not threaten the United States militarily. Its crisis is internal, economic, political, and humanitarian. But in Trump's political rhetoric, framing Venezuela as an enemy helps justify U.S. aggression and galvanize support among some domestic constituencies. But there is another dimension, one that is often overlooked. Venezuela is more than just a country. It is home to some of the world's largest proven oil reserves. It is the symbolic center of Latin America's long struggle for autonomy from Washington. And Venezuela maintains close ties with Russia, China, Iran, and Cuba. Trump's threat is therefore not just aimed at Caracas, it is aimed at the global system that challenges U.S. dominance. The closure of Venezuela's airspace not only isolates Maduro, but also restricts the movement of military advisors, flights, and cooperation with Russia and China. Trump's airspace threat reflects an attempt to reassert hegemony through force rather than diplomacy. It is a signal not just to Venezuela, but to every country in the global South. If you challenge Washington, you will face isolation, economic, diplomatic, and perhaps even military. This is why this crisis is more than just a headline. It exposes deep structural tensions in U.S.-Latin American relations and shows that old patterns of coercion, long considered obsolete, are returning with renewed vigor. In assessing how Venezuela is likely to respond to Trump's threat to block or lock down its airspace, I see a government that acts not on strength, but on the logic of survival under siege. For more than a decade, Venezuela has lived under escalating sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and covert destabilization efforts. To understand Caracas' next steps, it is important to recognize that the Maduro regime has built a complex strategy, part political, part economic, part military, designed to overcome U.S. pressure rather than confront it head-on. Trump's airspace threat gives Maduro something he has long used to consolidate his control at home, the image of an outside aggressor. Venezuela has limited capabilities, but it has Russian-made S-300 systems, Iranian drone technology, and Cuban intelligence advisors. These assets will not deter the U.S. Air Force, but they will increase the political and strategic costs of any U.S. escalation. Economically, Venezuela has been forced to live in a shadow system. With its formal financial channels blocked by sanctions, Caracas relies on informal oil networks, barter arrangements, and cryptocurrency-based transactions. If its control of the airspace is threatened, Venezuela will intensify these tactics. Intensifying oil for goods deals with China, Turkey, and Iran, increasing its reliance on submarine fleets of oil tankers, increasing cooperation with Russian logistics channels. When Washington threatens a Latin American government, it inadvertently bolsters that government's nationalist legitimacy. I have seen this pattern repeated over and over, from Cuba to Nicaragua to Iran. Maduro will use Trump's warning to rally the military, unite the political elite, and portray opposition groups as collaborators with U.S. interventionism. In this way, external pressure does not weaken the regime, but rather strengthens it. On the security front, Caracas does not want to directly confront Washington. Instead, it will build up its asymmetric military power. This means strengthening air defenses around key infrastructure. Caracas itself, its military bases, its oil export ports, its radar systems, and its communications nodes. These mechanisms are inefficient, corrupt, and costly for Venezuelans, but they allow the government to survive. Another possible response is diplomacy. Venezuela will appeal to the United Nations, CELAC, and other regional bodies, denouncing Washington's threats as a violation of its sovereignty. While such appeals rarely change U.S. policy, they help build political unity in the global South, where many countries still resent U.S. interventionism. But the most important takeaway is this: Venezuela's strategy is not victory. It is not collapse. Caracas understands that it cannot defeat Washington militarily. Instead, it aims to make regime change too costly, too chaotic, and too destabilizing for the United States. The longer the government survives, the more it demonstrates to other countries, especially those in the BRICS orbit, that U.S. pressure can be resisted. In essence, Venezuela's next moves will follow a predictable pattern: consolidate power internally, build resilience externally, and rely on allies to offset the worst effects of U.S. coercion. Trump's airspace threat will not topple the Venezuelan government. It will drive it into the arms of Russia, China, Iran, and other countries that want to challenge the hemisphere's old hierarchy. In analyzing how Russia might respond to Trump's threat to block Venezuela's airspace, I see a geopolitical relationship shaped not by ideology, but by strategic signaling. Russia sees Venezuela not simply as an ally, but as a symbol, an outpost against U.S. dominance in the Western Hemisphere. From Moscow's perspective, even modest defense of Caracas is a way to challenge what it sees as Washington's unilateral right to decide the political fate of sovereign states. Russia has been present in Venezuela for nearly 2 decades through military cooperation, energy investments, and political ties. This partnership deepened significantly after the U.S. recognized Juan Guaido as Venezuela's interim president in 2019. Moscow interpreted the move as a reaffirmation of U.S.-driven regime change. Since then, Russia's commitment has focused not only on defending international norms, sovereignty, non-interference, rejection of foreign-imposed governments, but also on defending Venezuela itself. In fact, I expect Russia to respond to Trump's airspace threat with a combination of symbolic displays of force and targeted material support. This could include rotations of military advisors to Caracas, highly publicized visits by long-range bombers, naval vessels or intelligence aircraft, support for radar, air defense, and cybersecurity resilience, and expanded cooperation on oil production, mining, and infrastructure. These actions serve multiple purposes. They reassure the Maduro regime. They complicate U.S. decision-making by raising the political costs of escalation. And they send a message to, we can play in your backyard just as you can play in ours. But it's important to recognize the limits. Russia doesn't have the economic capacity to save Venezuela's economy. It can't replace lost oil revenues on a massive scale, nor can it provide the financial liquidity needed to stabilize the country. Moreover, Russia is well aware of the risk of direct confrontation with the United States in the Caribbean. Putin is willing to support Venezuela, but he doesn't want to trigger a Cuban Missile Crisis too. Instead, Moscow's strategy is best described as a measured counterpressure. Russia provides just enough support to prevent Maduro from collapsing, but not enough to reverse Venezuela's economic decline. This support is largely geopolitical, a way to prevent Washington from achieving an easy victory and signal to the world that U.S. pressure has limits. But Russia's involvement in Venezuela has broader implications. It reinforces an emerging multipolar order in which major powers, Russia, China, Turkey, Iran, intervene diplomatically, economically, and sometimes militarily to counterbalance U.S. influence. In this context, Venezuela has become a theater of global power competition, not just a domestic crisis. From a broader perspective, I see Russia's actions as part of a doctrine that rejects regime change through sanctions and threats. Moscow has seen the consequences in Iraq, Libya, and its efforts in Syria. It believes that if Venezuela collapses under U.S. pressure, the same pattern will be applied elsewhere in Belarus, Central Asia, even along Russia's borders. Russia's support for Venezuela is therefore not just defensive. This is a preventive geopolitical shield, protecting a world order against U.S. unilateralism. Yet the paradox remains. Russia can help Maduro survive, but cannot revive him. Russia can provide political protection, but cannot bring economic renewal. When I look at China's role in the Venezuela crisis, I see a very different kind of partnership than Russia. China has lent Venezuela tens of billions of dollars over the past decade, much of it backed by oil shipments. Beijing does not want to see those investments evaporate, nor does it want Venezuela to fall into chaos, which could disrupt energy flows, regional stability, and China's reputation as a development partner in the global south. For Beijing, Venezuela is not simply a political ally. It is part of a broader South-South development architecture where China is positioning itself as an alternative to the U.S.-dominated financial system. I expect China to respond to Trump's airspace threat through several channels. First, by renegotiating or extending Venezuela's debt obligations, ensuring Caracas is not pushed into default. China has done this with the struggling African and Asian partners and will likely do so here. Second, China will maintain and potentially expand its oil for infrastructure arrangements, which ensure a steady supply of crude to Chinese refineries, often using tanker routes or submarine fleets designed to circumvent sanctions. Third, and perhaps most importantly, China will provide Venezuela with the technological and logistical tools to overcome its isolation, telecommunications infrastructure through Huawei and ZTE, digital payment systems independent of U.S. banking networks, surveillance and cyber capabilities that allow the regime to maintain internal control. Beijing sees these moves not as taking sides in a geopolitical struggle, but as defending a global principle, the right of developing countries to pursue independent political paths without being stifled by sanctions. Beyond China, Venezuela's support network includes a mix of partners within and outside the region. Cuba remains central, providing intelligence, counterintelligence, and internal security expertise. Nicaragua and Bolivia provide political alignment and diplomatic solidarity. Iran provides fuel, refinery components, and drone technology. Turkey provides gold refining channels and financial gateways. Collectively, these alliances form what I call a recovery ecosystem, not enough to restore Venezuela's economy, but enough to stave off collapse. It is a decentralized network of countries that reject unilateral U.S. power and come together to help each other overcome sanctions and pressure campaigns. The most important strategic implication is that U.S. coercion, rather than isolating Venezuela, has pushed it deeper into the arms of China and other non-Western partners. Beijing does not need to openly confront Trump. It simply quietly maintains Venezuela until Washington's political winds change. In this sense, China and its allies are shaping a new geopolitical reality in the Americas, one in which, for the first time in a century, the United States cannot unilaterally decide the fate of a Latin American country. The normalization of economic warfare and paramilitary coercion as routine tools of global governance, Trump's threat to block Venezuela's airspace is not an isolated case. It is part of a broader shift in which the United States increasingly relies on the tools of isolation, sanctions, asset seizures, secondary penalties, and the threat of airspace to shape political outcomes abroad. And in doing so, Washington risks undermining the very principles of sovereignty and non-intervention that underpin the modern international system. The Venezuelan crisis, viewed from this perspective, is more than a regional dispute. It is a test for the future of the hemispheric order. Will the Western Hemisphere continue to operate under a U.S. unilateralist doctrine where governments that defy Washington are punished with financial squeezes? Or will a multipolar order emerge with countries like Russia, China, Iran, and Turkey providing alternative lifelines to countries under pressure from the West? What I see is a gradual but unmistakable shift. U.S. sanctions no longer create compliance. They create opposing coalitions. Each new pressure campaign accelerates the building of networks, financial, diplomatic, technological, that bypass U.S. dominance. In Latin America, China has become many countries' largest trading partner, providing development finance without political conditions. Russia sends strategic signals that complicate U.S. intervention. Even small countries, from Cuba to Nicaragua to Bolivia, ally with Venezuela, not because they admire its system, but because they recognize a shared vulnerability to external coercion. Here is a paradox. The more the United States tries to isolate Venezuela, the more it isolates itself from the emerging structure of the global South. There is also a profound moral dimension. Economic warfare, even when conceived as a tool to pressure governments, always harms ordinary people. In Venezuela, sanctions have undermined access to medicines, food, and essential imports. A threat to airspace would further restrict the delivery of humanitarian aid, global travel, and commercial supply chains. Yet, the United States rarely acknowledges these consequences. The suffering is seen as collateral damage in a geopolitical game. Venezuela's allies, for all their limitations, offer a different logic: survival rather than subjugation. Russia provides political cover. China ensures minimal economic functionality. Cuba provides intelligence and stability tools. Iran ships fuel and spare parts. These efforts do not restore prosperity, but they prevent collapse and deny Washington the clean-cut outcome it desires. The bigger question, then, is not whether Maduro survives, but what kind of world order will emerge. Are sanctions and airspace threats acceptable tools in peacetime? Should great powers decide who governs weaker states? And how long can the global economy function when access to trade, finance, and transportation is weaponized? In my view, the way forward lies not in escalating coercion, but in dialogue, regional diplomacy, and genuine development engagement. Venezuela needs stability, not siege. Latin America needs investment, not intervention. And the United States needs a foreign policy based on cooperation rather than domination. If further crisis is to be avoided, the planet must restore the principles of sovereign equality, peaceful coexistence, and economic justice. Only then can nations, large and small, escape the destructive cycle of coercion and countervailing pressure that is shaping the region.